Hello, CFA candidates. Just want to share with you our strategy for doing the practice questions when it comes to level 3. So let's dive in. The first observation is as follows. Before you begin to attempt these signed questions, make sure that you've made a set of summary notes for all the LOSs. Your notes will by far be the most important element of your preparation. It is the foundation from which you will be able to answer most of the questions. So I'm a big believer in writing a little something down for each LOS, and there's two main benefits from that. So when you write something down, it forces you to understand it. See, it's one thing reading something, but it's another thing when you have to articulate that concept into your own words. So that transition from just reading it to actually translating it into a few words forces you to understand the material. And the other benefit is when you write something down, because of that muscle memory, it'll help you retain the material for longer periods so that on the exam it'll be easier for you to recall it. Because you can say, oh, I wrote a little something down regarding that matter. So tons of benefits in making brief summary notes for each LOS. Note 2. All the questions on this list are from the CFA curriculum, which is the exact source that the examiners will be using in formulating the exam questions. Ladies and gentlemen, the CFA Institute has made it very clear that the exam will be based out of curriculum content. So our philosophy naturally is, let's master the questions from the curriculum, and you should be okay on the exam. And this has worked very effectively in the past. However, not all the questions in the CFA curriculum are assigned on our list, and here's why. Instead, this list only contains questions that have a high return on time. Let me give you a little analogy. Suppose there's 10,000 stocks that are out there. Now, you wouldn't just put a little money in each of those 10,000 stocks, would you? That's not the way it works. What you would do is you do your analysis. You would pick the stocks that you think will give you the highest return on your capital, and those are the stocks that you would include in your portfolio. Well, why should things be any different here? There's thousands of questions that are available, and the return is not the same for all those questions. And here's what I mean. Our goal is to ensure that candidates get the most points for each hour invested in practice questions. Like you've seen some blue box questions, right? They go on for like 3 or 4 pages. And for the amount of time it takes to do that question, you could have done 5 or 6 other questions. So for that same hour you put in, you could have got more points on the exam by doing the other questions that we've assigned, rather than doing these big comprehensive questions. So do you see how we look at each question as in terms of how much return they yield per hour we invest? Now, how do we decide what's a high priority question or a question that's got a high return on time? The questions on this list are either directly related to an LOS, so that's the first criteria, or are bite-sized enough in which a similar question may appear on the exam. So those are the 2 criteria I use in selecting questions from the CFA curriculum. So first of all, I'll give you an example. Suppose that there's a chapter and there's tons of calculations in there, or there's questions that require a lot of computations. And then you look at the LOS, and you don't have a single LOS that says compute or calculate. So why are you spending like 10, 20, 30 minutes on a question that requires heavy computation when the LOS doesn't require you to compute? Instead, the LOS just says explain, or describe, or list. And that's the criteria we use in selecting these questions, because we know your time is limited. And even if you had all the time in the world, we know your capacity is limited. It's biology. So we just want to make sure we insert the questions that's going to yield you the most points during the exam. Now, the other thing is it's got to be bite-sized enough. So, for example, remember I told you there's some blue box questions that go on for 3 or 4 pages. There's no way a similar question like that can appear on the exam. You only have a few minutes to answer a question. So this is what I mean. The question has got to be bite-sized format in order for us to think, oh yeah, something like this could definitely appear on the exam. Now, any in-chapter example or end-of-chapter questions that is not on the list should be avoided. And the criteria for these are the opposite for the criteria I use to include the questions on the list. And here it is. These questions are either not related to an LOS, or are way too comprehensive to be formatted for the CFA exam. Now 3, you should review your LOS notes for a chapter and then attempt the examples and questions that are assigned on this list for that chapter. And you should repeat the cycle on a chapter by chapter basis. And let me show you what I mean. We're just going to go to page 2 of this document because that's where the list of questions begins. So here it is. The first chapter for which we've assigned questions is chapter 3, CME. And so the first thing I would do if I was a candidate is when it comes to chapter 3, I will review my LOS notes. That's the first thing I would do. So maybe that'll take me half an hour or so just to go through all the notes that I've made for chapter 3. And then I would do the questions that are assigned right here. And the logic there is your LOS notes sort of describe the concept, whereas the practice question is the application. So by doing this combined, you put everything together, i.e. you review the concepts, and then you apply them, and then it all comes together. And then you repeat the cycle for the next chapter. So the next chapter is chapter 4, same thing. First thing I would do is spend about half an hour or so reviewing my notes for chapter 4, so all the theories, all the concepts, the frameworks, and then I would do the questions that are assigned for that chapter. And I would repeat the cycle for every chapter. Now, one thing that I recommend is that you flag examples and questions that you may want to revisit at a later date. So if a question's giving you a hard time, ladies and gentlemen, don't get stuck. Just circle it, and I'll show you what I mean. Just for example, suppose I'm looking at question 14 from chapter 3. I'm just making it up at random. I've already spent about a minute, 2 minutes, and literally that's how long I would spend. To me, 1 minute is too long. And that's the philosophy you need for the level 3. Talk to any L3 that's completed their program now. They'll always tell you that time was against them, especially in the written part of the exam. So even 1 minute for me is like forever. So if it's taking me a minute or 2 at the most, and I'm still not able to make any headway, I will flag the question, i.e. I'll circle it. And that's the beauty with this list, is it's got the complete list of all the questions from the curriculum. So then after I've done all the other questions in the curriculum, I'll come back and reattempt the questions that I have flagged or circled on the list. And you'll be amazed that when you come back a second time, so after you've gone through all the other questions, you've got this momentum behind you, you've sharpened your analytical thinking, and then when you see that question again, you say, oh, okay, so this is what I got to do. That's how it works. Furthermore, in the event that a chapter does not have any assigned questions, you should still review your LOS notes for that particular chapter before moving on to the next one. So out of the entire curriculum, maybe there's like a handful of chapters that don't have any assigned questions, but you should still review your notes even if there are no assigned questions for that chapter. Rule 4, I alluded to this before, but it's so important. I don't mind just repeating this 10,000 times. Never get stuck. It's that simple. I'll give you an analogy. What happens if you stop swimming? You'll sink. It's the exact same philosophy, ladies and gentlemen. You got to have that internal clock that says, I got to keep moving because time is not stopping. So what do you do if a question's giving you a hard time? You go immediately to the solution. And this will ensure you don't waste too much time on any one particular question. That's freeing you up to cover as many questions as possible. And that's the most important thing, is you need to take the hill. That means you got to get through all the questions. And then you go back and you plug any holes that you may have, i.e. you go back to those questions that you may have flagged initially. Now, what counts is not whether you're able to get a question right the first time you attempt it, but whether you'll be able to get a similar question correct on the exam. What does that mean? Well, some candidates think that the first time they attempt a question, they have to get it right. And that's not how it works. That's not how it works. Professionals don't think like that. With professionals, the only day that counts is the championship game day. So for you, that's the day of the CFA exam. So that means before then, there's no point in, spending all this time just to get one question correct. Because the time you spend on that question is time you're taking away from moving on to the subsequent chapters. So candidates that adopt this approach, i.e., I gotta get this question before I move on to the next one, a lot of times they don't even get through all the assigned questions. 5, to avoid burnout, make one weekday each week a non-CFA exam day. So practice questions becomes our focus in the final 8 to 10 weeks. So during that phase, it's very important that you maintain an element of freshness. So we don't want you burn out before exam day. So maybe one day a week on a weekday, because on the weekends you want to put in as many hours in your prep as possible. But during the weekday, after work, that one day, do something else. So like I said, you got to have an element of freshness. Every other day, though, be sure to attempt as many practice questions as possible. Every hour of prep is going to count. So in that final 8 to 10 week period, it really is like playoff season. So every game is going to count for more. So let's say 5 months before your exam, when you initially started your prep, maybe 15 hours a week was sufficient. But in this final 8 to 10 week period, where you're just focusing on practice questions, you need to be putting in at least 20 hours per week, because you're so close to the exam that every hour you put in is going to count for more during the exam. 6, do not worry about speed or grade when attempting these practice questions, especially the written part. Don't even bother grading your written part. I never did when I was a candidate, because I didn't know if the criteria I used was the same one that the grader was going to use, and I didn't know how much discretion the grader would be using, right? So first of all, both speed and grade will improve naturally as you attempt more questions. That's a given. For now, your focus should be on understanding the concept underlying each question. And that's what I did when I was a candidate. When I was doing practice questions, I didn't grade myself. I didn't clock myself. And I was just more interested in developing a deep-rooted understanding of the underlying concept, because I knew that speed and grade will just improve naturally. Note 7, you're strongly encouraged not to use any third-party Q banks. Here's what a third-party Q bank is. It's someone else's guess as to what's going to be on the exam. So you want to base your entire preparation on someone else's guess. How does that sound? Hear it out. How risky is that? So someone sat there, someone that's got nothing to do with the CFA Institute sat there and drew up a bunch of questions, trying to, basically it's a guess, right? The CFA Institute has made it very clear that the exam will be based on curriculum content. So why not just master curriculum content, which is what we do. We just look at the questions from the curriculum, we pick the high return questions, and we just master those, because we know the grader is eyeballing those same questions. There it is. CFA examiners will only be drawing questions from the curriculum, which is where the assigned questions below are from. 8, attempt the questions in the order of the readings that are presented below. Since the list starts off with more quant-heavy oriented chapters, you may find progress to be relatively slow in the beginning. Don't worry, this is expected. Just stay on course and do not be discouraged. One thing I've seen candidates do that doesn't work is the following. So they have this schedule where each day of the week they've listed which chapters they're going to cover. That doesn't work, ladies and gentlemen. That doesn't work, because not all chapters are the same. So the quant-heavy chapter will probably take 2 or 3 times longer than to complete a qualitative chapter. So rather than having your schedule in terms of chapters, just tell yourself, I got to put in 20 hours each week. Doesn't matter how many chapters I cover. If I stick to these rules, i.e. never get stuck, flag these questions and just move on, and at the same time I'm putting in 20 hours a week, I guarantee you that not only will you get through all the questions, but you'll have time to come back to all those flagged questions. And the other thing is, in the final week, I always recommend taking that final week off work. So that final week, you're putting in 30, 40 hours. So again, schedule your week in terms of how many hours you're going to put in rather than how many chapters you're going to cover. Because I've seen it over and over. Like candidates who use that rigid approach, i.e. I got to finish this chapter by this day, that breaks down within the first few days. Now, so with the L3, of course, we have the item set and we have the written part. So what's the strategy for both? Here we go. So for the item set, each case is effectively a compilation of set of independent issues, which is often presented in the same order as the questions that follow. Let me just illustrate here. So with these item sets, what you got is, typically 4 paragraphs, and then you have 4 questions. So the way you should approach this is as follows. Read the first item set question, and then proceed to read the case until you come across a section that corresponds to the requirement of that question. So here's what I mean. So when I see this item set for the first time, I'll start off reading question 1. So what do they want, right? And then I'll start reading the case. So from the first paragraph. And the way this is set up, 99% of the time is as follows. The sequence of the case corresponds with the sequence of the question. So the contents to answer the first question is in the first paragraph. The contents to answer the second question is the second paragraph, and so forth. So read question 1, then go to the case, read the first paragraph, and then, I'll answer question 1. So I'll say, it's B. And then what I'll do is I'll read question 2. What do they want? And then I'll go back to the item set and I'll pick up where I left off. And like I said, 99% of the time, the contents for question 2 is found in the second paragraph. So I'll get the points that I need, and then I'll answer question 2. So let's say it's C, and then I'll just keep repeating the process. Then I'll read question 3, go back to the item set, pick up where I left off, and until I answer question 3, let's just say that's A, and I would just keep repeating the cycle. So there it is. After solving the first question, read the requirements of the next question, and then resume again your progression through the case until you solve that question. Repeat the cycle until all questions are answered. Consequently, instead of tackling the case as a whole, you break it down into little pieces, addressing each question individually. So that's all that is, ladies and gentlemen. That's all that is. It's not a big case. It's 4 independent issues that have just been converged into one. The only thing that's common among the paragraphs is that they usually have a junior analyst. That's their MO. That's their commonality. This junior analyst, whatever the guy's name is, he just works down the paragraph. And the first paragraph, he's talking to the portfolio manager about one thing. And then he's talking to the research analyst about another thing, and he's talking to his broker and his client about another thing. But again, they're all independent issues. Furthermore, since the questions are independent of each other, the outcome from the preceding question will have no impact on the outcome of the subsequent question. So we know that. All right, so now let's address the 800-pound gorilla, right? So every L3 talks about, worries about, or is anxious about the written part. So let's tackle it. So first thing we should do is read the requirements of the question before reading the case. So same philosophy as the item sets. The length of your answer should correspond with the points awarded to that question. Typically, for every valid point you make, you'll be awarded 1.5 to 2 marks. So again, you got to use your discretion, your judgment. But a lot of these exams are pretty explicit. They tell you, like, list 2 things, right? Describe 2 arguments or whatever. So it's not as open-ended as you think. And in fact, what I like to refer to, a lot of people refer to this section as the essay part. I call it the short answer part, because that's a more appropriate description of what this is, right? You don't have time for an essay. Point 3, keep your responses short and to the point. Your answers are not expected to be as comprehensive as the official solution set, not even close, As well, you're not required to justify why you did not select the other alternative courses of action that may have been available. So just remember that, ladies and gentlemen, just keep it short to the point. In fact, what I always recommend is when you're first doing these questions, provide a skeleton set of answers. until you get through all the questions. And then if you have time, you come back and you can add a little more if you want. But the first thing I would do is, like I said, just a skeleton set of answers so that if I ever run out of time, at least I've attempted every question. In fact, let me give you an analogy. I'd rather provide a skeleton set of answers for 10 questions than to provide a complete set of answers for 7 questions. Because I know if I put a skeleton response for these 10 questions, I will accumulate a lot more points than this approach. Because if you do like just 7 questions, but you answered it from top to bottom, guess what? There's 3 questions you never got to, which you got 0 on. Point 4, if a question asks you to list 2 items, only the first 2 will be graded. So even if you provide 5 answer choices and the last 3 are correct, no one's going to look at the last 3. They'll just look at the first 2 you provided. Use bullet points. Elaborating on your answer is a waste of time. The goal is to provide a sufficient response rather than a perfect one. Because remember, you have a really time constraint. However, if you do complete the exam ahead of time, then you may revisit the answers that could use a little bit more content. 6, for the calculation questions, simply indicate your final answer. While inputting your calculations may qualify for part marks, the time that this will take away from other questions may be detrimental to your overall grade. It's just more efficient to do that. Just put your final answer. Now, the graders, they know of systematic mistakes. In other words, they have a range of answers. And so even if you wrote the wrong answer, they know why you got it wrong. Because based on your response, they'll say, oh, this candidate added this variable instead of subtracting it. So they already know. They already know. Or you multiplied it instead of dividing because they worked it out. So it's not worth showing your work just because it's so time consuming. Now tip, this is the big one for the written. The best way to ace the written segment is by mastering the subject matter. The more knowledgeable you are, the easier it is to answer the question. This will by far be more important than the formatting of the question, i.e. whether it's in multiple choice or written part. Ladies and gentlemen, if candidates have an issue with the written part, it's not the format. It's the understanding of the material, right? Because if you know something really well, it shouldn't matter how I ask you the question. Like if I asked you, how do you get to work from home? Does it matter what the formatting of the question is? Whether it's open-ended or whether I give you a series of multiple choice or left or right, doesn't matter. You'll know, right? Because you've mastered that knowledge, and it's the same philosophy here. So the more you understand the underlying material, the easier it is to answer those questions. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. The examples and questions that are bolded in red have pass mark solutions available. What's the difference between my solution and the book solutions? The book solutions use a lot of formulas, which sort of leads candidates to memorize. I use a ground-up solution, which helps you better understand what's going on. And I'll just show you very quickly. So just for example, the first chapter that we've assigned questions for is chapter 3. So you can see that example 2, 5, and these questions are in red. So let me take you to our portal for L3. Here we are. So here's chapter 3, capital market expectations. And at the bottom of that chapter module, you see where the practice questions are. So I'll just click that. And there it is. So you can see those same those same assigned questions are listed there. And then there's my solution. So yes, example 2 is bolded in red. And then you can see I have a set of solutions there. And I encourage you to use the ground up. And like I said, because I'd rather have you guys know what's going on rather than just memorizing a set of formulas. Now, in closing, ladies and gentlemen, the closer you stick to the game plan, the better your chances will be on exam day. So thank you. Good luck.